The secrets of our times are coded in the games we play.
Video games say a lot about the period in which they were created.
Video games are an expressive and representative art form.
An art form that was born in an era filled with fear.
No one can foresee precisely what costs or casualties will be incurred.
Isn't it nice that something like Cold War technology could, in its own adversarial way, spawn something that was adversarial in a really pleasurable way?
Video games will lead us into the future with eyes wide open.
It's a very, very complex and powerful art form, and the best is yet to come.
How strange all this began with the push of a button. Video games are the future of entertainment, a multi-billion-dollar industry that has drawn our world into its digital domain.
Video games are not just art, but they're culture, they're creativity. They represent, in many ways, a more complex structure than a good movie.
First of all, CPUs are awesome now. They're really fast. Video card acceleration basically makes games really immersive. Screens are bigger now. You feel like you are like really there.
No video!
Producing a video game today is like producing a movie.
And action!
It takes 100, 150 people, costs $10 million.
Stop. Wait, go back.
From the beginning, video games have been a reflection of the times.
What games do, like any form of entertainment, is they actually are a way for us to kind of have a perspective on our existence, on human existence, just like books do, just like movies do, just like in its own way music does.
In our world, staying connected is essential. Yet even beyond video games, pushing a button today is simply a part of living in the 21st century. However, a mere 50 years ago, citizens of the world wanted nothing to do with one particular button: the red button.
When people think about the idea of pushing the button, in the 50s that didn't mean pushing the button to play a video game, it meant pushing the button to end the world.
1, 0.
I was right next to a place called Hill Air Force Base. We felt we would be one of the big targets.
We heard about all the fears in Russia. We have the special course in the schools and in colleges about so-called civil defense, how we should act in case of some kind of mass destruction.
The Cold War is becoming evident. With about 5 million Red Army troops and 2 million internal security.
Our nations teetered on the precipice of a Cold War, and early computer technology emerged to render our collective fear.
No one can foresee precisely what course it will take, or what costs or casualties will be incurred.
The Cold War was an elongated stretch of diplomatic conflict between the communist world and the free world. It was a war that was called cold because it never really flared up into open conflict.
President Kennedy ordered a blockade of Cuba and demanded that Russia remove this threat to peace.
The Cold War was a matter of pitting one simulation against another. The games are a technology about simulation. We use them to model real-world processes to predict results. And to some degree, that's exactly what was taking place in Washington and Moscow. It's like one global version of the game Battleship.
To protect the future of America, defense techniques of tomorrow had to be discovered now.
The Cold War was nothing but a simulation to begin with. So there is no war to study. There's only these possible future wars, these fears of war, these probable outcomes.
While the sirens wailed their grim warning, hundreds of thousands of...
These virtual simulations and early Cold War computers reflected our fears, but they couldn't allay them. The player couldn't control the missiles.
People like predictable worlds with predictable outcomes, or at least controllable outcomes, or at least the perception that if you got the skill, you could control it. That's very satisfying. because the world in general is pretty uncontrollable and a little bit daunting sometimes.
The first computer game would soon arise from the technology of the Cold War, and the world, simulated or otherwise, would never be the same.
Will be 40 seconds. Be aware you have tank flight ahead.
In the 50s, the Cold War had launched the development of computer technology for combat and missile simulations.
This is part of the military strength of the United States.
As the rehearsal for war intensified, a young physicist working in a nuclear lab forever changed how the world viewed the button. In 1958, William Willie Higginbotham, who had worked on the first atomic bomb, turned two rudimentary lines and a bouncing ball into the first interactive entertainment experience on a computer, Tennis for Two.
Every weekend they would have these contests to see who could come up with the coolest thing. Yeah, Willie Higginbotham came up with this idea that you could take an oscilloscope and make a tennis game out of it.
It was an expression of a kind of rebellious adolescent energy, working alongside the military projects, taking this most expensive piece of equipment at the time and repurposing it to play games.
Suddenly, computers had a use beyond military computations. But as the war evolved, so would the games and the players.
Laika, first space traveler, was ready for the takeoff, and here it is.
And I do remember all this noise about the dogs coming in the space. I even remember their names, you know, Belka and Strelka and whatever, you know.
Shortly after Laika's flight, the Russian man-in-space program began. The same centrifuge that tested Laika was now adapted for human experiments.
Definitely Gagarin's flight was a very big deal in '61.
Major Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin was launched into orbit around the Earth.
Yuri Gagarin had taken the first steps into outer space for the USSR, but America wasn't far behind.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The Cold War became a race to space.
On the space age.
And it deeply influenced Steve Russell, an MIT programmer who carried video games into the next realm with his own virtual space war.
Space race was very much in the news. And, you know, spaceships taking off, spaceships blowing up were something that you could hardly escape. And further, I had just read Doc Smith's Lesman series. These are a bunch of science fiction stories where the heroes went zooming across the galaxy, inventing new technology as they went, being pursued by the forces of pure evil.
Before he could battle the forces of pure evil, Steve Slug Russell had to master the hulking PDP-1 campus computer.
This is a PDP-1, the first computer I met like a modern personal computer. You can turn it on with one switch.
It was considered at the time a microcomputer, meaning it was only the size of a refrigerator.
It cost $120,000, and it did something simple like typing or being a desk calculator. The programs were typically called expensive, so there was expensive typewriter and expensive desk calculator.
It didn't show anything spectacular. It was so unimpressive that they kind of felt like, no way, we can do, with this PDP, we can do something way cooler.
Eventually, we figured out that, well, you could have two spaceships and they could fire torpedoes at each other. Yeah, okay. That's kind of boring. Can you make something blow up? Yeah.
If Tennis for Two was a light-hearted Cold War distraction, Steve Slug Russell's game was a direct expression of the space race and the global fear of space war.
That was straight out of the times. That was, you know, that was that feeling of the Soviet paranoia, you know, communism's gonna kick our ass. I mean, that played right into the collective consciousness of society. It says, we're kind of afraid here, you know, are we going to go to war?
It was truly remarkable and ahead of its time, and it was profoundly influential on me.
think it was the world's most popular computer game for a couple of years, mostly because it was the only one.
The coding instructions for the game were passed from programmer to programmer, and any institution with a PDP-1 computer inevitably had a version of Space War also.
So it became open source, and we gave copies of the sources to anybody who looked and anyone who wanted them.
These were young guys in their 20s who were part of a group that we think of today as the first generation of hackers.
It wasn't so much rebellion as exploration. You know, there were all these new things to do and see. Sort of joy of a bright, shiny new erector set with lots of different new parts. And you can build things.
One of the things Steve Russell built was the foundation for what would become the most important part of any video game experience, the joystick.
Originally, the controls were just from the console switches. And then some of the Model Railroad Club guys built a control box using surplus telephone parts.
Steve Russell was also the first programmer to put destruction on the screen.